On a Wednesday afternoon, my mom called to tell me my grandmother was dying. I had no reaction. I hadn't seen or talked to my grandmother since she moved to Florida when I was a teenager. That was 20 years ago. My grandmother was a miserable old curmudgeon, and we never had much of a relationship, or so I thought. The doctor said my grandmother had days to live, and my mom and dad were heading down to Florida to say their goodbyes. They wanted to know if I wanted to come along. Sure, I said, even though I had nothing to say to her. The woman was practically a stranger. My only memories of my dad's mother were of her dusty house that smelled of mold, and how she stared daggers at me when I was a small child. But when I hung up the phone with my mom, other memories began clawing their way to the surface. Fragments and snippets, mainly, but they were there. My childhood bedroom, an old telephone, and my grandmother's voice on the other line. I began to put it together, a sequence of events that had sunk deep down to places I couldn't find. And so the night before we were supposed to leave for Florida, I sat down in my parents' living room and attempted to assemble the puzzle. Speaking to my parents with a mug of hot chocolate in my hand, my story spilled out. When I was 10 years old, I had an old rotary phone with a spinning and clicking dial on the nightstand next to my bed. At 2 a.m. one night, the clanging ring of the phone startled me awake. I picked up the receiver and heard nothing but ragged and harsh breathing. It went on, and I just lay awake in bed with the receiver at my ear, just listening. I eventually fell asleep, and I awoke with the receiver still on my shoulder and the dial tone beeping in my ear. A few nights later, the phone rang again at 2 a.m. I lifted the receiver and was again greeted with the same labored breath. But this time, there was a voice. My grandmother's voice. Someone's been a bad boy. A very bad boy. The words came out slow and methodical, each syllable more important than the last. I just listened in my dark and quiet room, unable to move, unable to run to my parents. No one knows what you did, but I know. The mug of hot chocolate shook in my hand as I told my parents what I heard my grandmother say. My dad's eyes were glazed over, deep in thought, like he couldn't believe that his own mother would do something like this. My mom looked at me with pleading eyes that begged the question, why didn't you tell me when it happened? The fact is, I was a bad boy. I'd done typical and naughty 10-year-old things. I'd slugged a kid on the playground and broke his glasses. I'd pocketed a candy bar at the store without paying. I'd cheated on a spelling test. Somehow my grandmother had known these things, and I remembered being a kid, lying in bed with that phone at my ear, desperately not wanting my parents to discover the awful things I'd done. Because somehow, my awful, wretched grandmother knew. I'm not sure how many calls there were, a handful perhaps, but one night a few weeks after the first phone call, the situation changed. I was again awoken by the clanging of the phone in the dead of night. I lifted the receiver from its cradle and put the phone to my ear, and I was greeted by the hoarse breathing of an old woman. I'll be there soon. I know what you did, Ben. My name is not Ben, but that didn't make the least amount of difference to me at the time. The phone went dead in my ear, and I then noticed a silence all around me. I listened intently to every creak in the house, every rustle of the wind through the tree branches outside my window. And then I heard the jiggling of the front door downstairs. I crept from my room and tiptoed down the hallway, and I knelt down at the top of the stairs, peering through the wooden railings. The front door squeaked open no more than 6 inches, and a hand reached inside, gripping the end of the door. I gawked at the hand's bony fingers and fingernails, so long that they were beginning to curl, and I heard the breathing. The same gravelly and throaty noise from the phone. I turned away, put my back against the railings, hugged myself, and began to cry. My dad must have heard my whimpering because suddenly he was there, picking me up and sheltering me. I remember my eyes pinching shut and not looking at the doorway. I wasn't sure if the woman with the curved fingernails had come all the way inside or if she'd simply sinked away into the night. My dad took me into his bedroom and I slept between my parents, shivering softly. My story ended. That was all I could remember. My parents sat in silence until my mom spoke up. She remembered that night. It was the only time after the age of 5 that I'd crawled into bed with him. My dad still looked spaced out. He had no memory of that evening, he said. Couldn't remember picking me up, couldn't remember carrying me into my parents' bedroom. My mom put her hand on my shoulder and told me how proud she was of me for finally letting it out. I could only laugh softly. I wasn't purposefully holding it in all this time. I didn't know the story was there to begin with. We decided to still go visit my grandmother. In the end, it was my decision. If I wanted answers, I did not have long to get them. I looked into my future and saw a lifetime of wondering just how this monster could do something like that. I didn't want to live like that, so I seized on my only chance for closure. I told my mom and she nodded, saying whatever I wanted to do was fine. The three of us were silent throughout the flight. My mom bit her lower lip and sat with a crossword puzzle on her lap for 3 hours, not filling in more than 5 words. She simply turned the pen over and over in her hand. My dad stared blankly out the window, as if my mom and I weren't even there. Neither of them asked me any more questions about my phone calls. I got the distinct feeling my mom wanted to. She'd steal a look at me, start to speak, but decide against it. We touched down in Florida, cabbed it to the hospital, and were about to walk through the sliding glass doors when my dad stopped. He turned around, red in his eyes, and he began to sob. He collapsed onto a bench and said he couldn't go through with this. He couldn't accuse his own mother. He couldn't interrogate a feeble old woman on her deathbed. I had an affair, he stammered. 20 years ago, and he had a child with another woman. A child the woman named Ben. My mom and I stood in the shadow of the hospital, shell-shocked. My story had finally opened up something inside of him, my dad said, and he was determined to stop living a lie. I left my parents and dazedly stumbled inside. Nothing made sense. I needed to see my grandmother. I needed to know the truth. I found my way to my grandmother's room, and she was already gone. My aunt and uncle stood, vigil by her frail corpse, holding her hand. There were no curling fingernails, no elongated fingers, just a wrinkled dead woman. Maybe if I'd gone inside minutes earlier, I'd have recognized that hoarse breath as my grandmother inhaled and exhaled one last time. But now I'd never know. I looked through the window and watched my father wander aimlessly around the hospital grounds, lost inside the new, hazy world he'd created for himself. And I wondered how it must feel to keep a secret that you do know about for 20 years. And then how it feels to get something like that off your chest. And I wondered about the other woman, and about Ben, and where they are now, and if I'd ever ran into them at the supermarket or driven past their house. And I wondered about the person that called me on the phone and crept into my house all those years ago. Was it not my grandmother after all? And just some cruel trick played by my dad's mistress? Or someone that knew about my dad's affair? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was my mom. I found her sunk into a lobby sofa, and I sat down next to her. She looked oddly peaceful. She probably just hadn't absorbed everything yet. I put my hand on my mom's shoulder, and then she thanked me for telling my story, for remembering it all because it brought out the truth from my dad. And even though the truth was horrible and would change things forever, it was good to know. But then I began to question my own story. Was it all in my head? Why did I not remember any of it until a few days ago? My eyes welled with tears. I told my mom it felt like I destroyed our family because of a story that could be make-believe, a story from the mind of a 10-year-old who was now lost to time. My mom reassured me. She believed my story was true. She didn't know who was in our house and what my dad might have seen that night, but she believed me. But still, she said, "There's one part of my story that she didn't understand. That old rotary phone in your bedroom. You do remember that was a play phone, right?"